So, how to think about this link between relief and development, right? So, I mean, in a very simple and immediate way, one could think about examples such as the Continuum project of UNDP, or indeed the FAO, the Food Organization, Food Agency of the UN, Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN system, idea of household livelihoods security framework, right? So again, here is an attempt to think about the ways in which relief, say post-drought relief, or indeed drought relief assistance programs could be linked up to longer terms objectives, ways of using the funds, the projects, the programs dispersed or implemented and set up for addressing the emergency needs of populations caught up in whatever emergency, be it a civil war or a drought, how those programs, projects, and funds could already be working towards a post-emergency situation, how better to spend. And this is perhaps best captured by the sentence expressed again by one of the participants in that IDS 1994 workshop, that protecting livelihoods saves lives, right? Let me try to kind of unpack what I've said so far, and I try to show you the broader context in which ideas about relief and development came to be combined and thought of in a coordinated sense. I provide you some examples of policy changes, but ultimately the essential idea is to move away, for all of these programs, is to move away from a representation of the relief to development continuum in these terms, where there is a short term, a medium term, and a long term set of interventions, and to kind of move away from the relay race, as it is called here, whereby different actors are responsible for different phases of the development of the relief and development program of aid intervention, but while actually capturing all of them as a whole and together, right? In many cases, a working group, humanitarianism, NGO said in 2006, in many cases, a linear model is impractical, right? If anything, because while in some areas there may well still be displaced populations or populations who are in dire need of food supplies as their livelihoods have been broken, in other places in the countries invested by these programs are impracticable. The example provided in this document relates to minefields, but there are always pockets or cities or neighborhoods within cities where actually the reconstruction and rehabilitation program have begun, where livelihoods are being restored progressively. And so to think about country-wide programs or region-wide programs that only focus on one phase would kind of not take into account the diverse contexts and experiences in each of these different places. So the concept of the continuum was developed to describe this state of affairs, i.e. a range of simultaneous measures that have to be linked, right? So the continuum approach is an attempt to satisfy acute needs and simultaneously create structures that make the people affected less vulnerable to emergency situation and help them to prevent future crises. Again, protective livelihoods saves lives. I mean, that's a very important statement, if you wish, in the sense that it kind of invests practical development-related concerns with livelihoods, or say at the household level, but one could think of at broader scales, with the humanitarian imperative of saving lives. And that, in a sense, is what captures this set of transformations we are discussing, right? Now, what were the key rationales and logics that were informing these programs, I mean, they were mostly borrowed from development, right? From the development project. For example, one could think of the influence that Amartya Sen had in shaping mainstream development thinking throughout the 90s. In fact, some people call the 90s the UNDPization of refugee assistance, in the sense that ideas about multidimensional poverty, i.e. poverty not being exclusively an income-related issue, ideas about capabilities and the vulnerabilities of individual households and communities, and indeed a view of development that unfolds primarily around the concept of livelihoods, kind of took over the development paradigm throughout the 90s. And these were in turn translated, transported, transformed, and adapted to a context in which relief, or rather relief and development programs were to be implemented. So in a sense, there was I mean, by linking relief and development projects into a continuum, what the kind of best practices that actually informed specific programs and projects were mostly borrowed from development or development discourses and ideas. And this is precisely because the idea was to begin to plan, think, and construct development already from the emergency phase. But indeed, it was not only Amartya Sen who deeply influenced development interventions, or indeed programs and policies in the 90s, but neoliberalism was the key force, perhaps, or according to many, was indeed the key force shaping how to think about development, what kind of policies should be implemented, the kind of common sense, quote unquote, assumptions that informed development interventions. Look at the four principles that emerge from that workshop, and I take them as kind of a proxy or an example of the kind of thinking that went behind the relief and development continuum projects and ideas, right? So top priority, a basic relief safety net was operational, okay? So it is not about universal provisions, it's about safety nets to vulnerable populations. It is a bottom-up process. Remember key neoliberal ideas about voices and voices of the poor. I mean, again, here, Robert Chambers, a great influence in all of these programs. Ideas of bottom-up accountability is not about the state providing, or indeed the international community providing, setting up plans and providing aid, but it's about listening to what communities need. They know best what they require in order to improve their livelihoods or increase the possibilities of having a better life, if you wish, right? High priority should be given to improved functioning of markets with minimal administrative intervention. So once again, once relief and development became conjoined, well, then the neoliberal influence on the development project, well, came to invest humanitarian assistance in equal matters. If you accept that any relief activity has to be linked to development, well, what kind of development or what kind of policies and programs should we set up to achieve developmental outcomes? Becomes a question that is informed by, well, mainstream ideas about development, and the force of neoliberalism is present. If you look at the World Development Report of 1997, you get a clear sense of how all of these principles are deeply connected to the neoliberal agenda that is expressed in that end of the 90s document. So let me zoom in now. I mean, so far, effectively, I talked about relief and development. Relief that I mean, covers situations that go well beyond the specific context of refugee aid and refugee assistance, right? So relief can cover issues related, I mean, anything from an earthquake to a drought, indeed a civil war. Indeed, it may well involve forms of displacement, but not necessarily of a refugee type. In other words, not necessarily under the mandate or prescriptions contained in the 1951 Convention and so forth. How does what I mentioned until now relate to, and how can it be used to think about the ways in which refugee assistance proper came to be linked to development ideas? And indeed, while initially, with regard to aid programming in response to natural disasters, these ideas were steadily adapted to respond to the demands of conflict-related crises. This shift was premised on some of the same goals as that of natural disasters, right? So that relief actors should approach developmental approaches in long duration conflict. So in a sense, the process of translation and adaptation of the development imperatives set up as mainstream during the 90s, i.e., again, as a recap, deeply informed by an neoliberal agenda, but also with strong development practitioners kind of voices, and I mentioned Robert Chambers, for example, came to be kind of tout court translated and adapted to refugee assistance programs. One clear example, and again, your core reading should provide some food for thought in that respect, is the idea of moving from large-scale relief programs to much smaller scale ones, right? So if you remember in the 80s, if you take the classic book by Harold Bond about imposing aid, well, here again, this classical quintessential ideas about stages in the settlement program. Refugees are given relief aid and transported to camps. Second stage is about providing tools and seeds and primary education. And finally, the third phase, aid is withdrawn on the grounds that refugees should be then self-sufficient and integrated into the local communities, right? So it's about moving away from those large-scale programs in which education, food distribution, health services and provisions, seeds, agricultural inputs are provided to large groups of populations, quite often, in fact, if not most exclusively, hosted and accommodated in refugee camps. Let's move from that idea, very top-down, to a much more bottom-up, or at least a different way of thinking about refugee aid and displacement. And there are, if you wish, three broad examples that I want to touch upon. Something related to integrated zonal approach, refugee aid and development, and some of the many acronyms or kind of programs that were set up to think about how to plan for a phasing out of refugee assistance. Okay. So integrated zonal development, what is that? I mean, here again, you can see how the way in which it was initially conceptualized, and in fact, perhaps this is common throughout these examples, is that of thinking about the development needs of particular areas and having refugees involved, right? So use assistance provided to settlement in poor countries as the basis for development activities that would bring long-term benefits to both the refugees and the local population. Large influx of refugees, setting up of refugee camps, as by now you know, refugees produce transformation, not only political, but certainly economic, social. The idea was to approach the relief of or relief assistance in a developmental manner in ways that would not create distinctions or perhaps further distinctions between refugees and local populations. What are the development needs of a particular area, a province, a region, a valley, or a watershed? Uh, and let's do them. Let's address those needs through our programs and aid and aid assistance, but in ways that are not particularly targeting refugees. One of the crucial aspects of refugee assistance was also quite often in many contexts that it created enmities between host populations, host communities rather, and refugee communities in areas where they were settled. So through this approach, the idea was to kind of bridge the gap between, let's say, legal statuses, citizen and refugee, and address the development needs of particular areas in recognition that the influx of often large refugee communities indeed transformed or affected those needs in and on themselves. In principle, I mean, if I were in class, I would ask you, what do you think about that? What do you think about that? Take one moment to think about this approach. One could say is great. I mean, in a sense, in principle, again, provided how those needs are defined and identified, but it creates a big political problem in the sense that it may give credence or it may support the idea that refugees are there to stay, something that perhaps in the 60s or in the 70s or in the period in which this was implemented might well have been the case, in the sense that there was no expected end to conflict anytime soon, but became increasingly difficult to digest for many governments, indeed for many political parties and interests. Refugees must return, and any attempt at kind of bridging the gap or creating, or sorry, undermining the separation between refugee and citizen is quite often politically problematic, right? The corollary to that approach is instead to focus exclusively on refugees and on the developmental and self-sufficiency needs of refugee communities, right? So under the RAD program, the Refugee Aid and Development set of policies, the idea was that assistance should be, from the onset of a refugee crisis, be development oriented, as we discussed before in the previous videos, and should be geared towards enhancing refugees' self-reliance. Right? It should incorporate support for sure, but it would be mostly about creating self-reliant communities. Self-reliant meaning communities who have enough jobs, occupations, income generating activities that can provide for themselves, that would make them self-reliant, i.e. not in need of further aid assistance, of food delivery, that would enable them to go and buy their food in the market, in the local market, without the need for receiving it from the international community. Indeed, some of these programs were working, in a sense, putting together the expertise of the UNHCR and UNDP, involved the government, the host government most often, and were backed financially by international community. Okay, some examples are, well, some examples are contained in the core reading, where you see the kind of, well, difficult act of balancing the different interests and needs of various operations. I mean, in the case of IGPRA, it was mostly about, in fact, the World Bank was even involved in this program, and it was addressing some development needs of the host government, but would hire mostly refugees, right? It would provide them with income opportunities, and there were other reasons, to the point that you can see the numbers here. I mean, the million of work days that were made available to refugees as a result of this program was indeed quite significant. So here again, the idea is to identify development needs of the area as a whole, but to target refugees in terms of income generating opportunities, therefore putting them to work. I mean, again, a moment of pause here would be needed to reflect upon similar ideas that are put in practice nowadays and proposed by the people like Alexander Betts, who thinks that refugees should be put to work in export processing zones in Jordan. I mean, we can discuss that in class during the second part, but certainly that is the key kind of underlying idea: provide work to refugees in ways that benefit the host country. Indeed, development-oriented priorities set for refugees aid, identify development initiatives in refugee situation, deliver corresponding support, which means cash, and share responsibilities between states. I mean, a lot of the language of UNHCR and indeed UNDP, when it came to be involved in these issues, was about shared responsibility for the burden of hosting refugees. How do we contribute to the costs created by the presence of refugees in particular countries? How do we contribute to the costs incurred by the host country? How do we alleviate that? How do we allow ourselves to create funds and programs that would benefit the host country as much as refugees? A corollary to all of this are those programs and projects that were mostly geared towards returnees, i.e. people who have returned. I mean, again, one thing that I have been unable to kind of show when it comes to context is how these different ideas and programs were implemented mostly in different parts of the world. Here, for example, QUIPS, something that many within UNHCR hailed as the quintessential example of a very effective, very low-cost initiative, were mostly implemented in the context of Central American civil wars towards the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. And they were really about going to a community with a pile of cash, say, what are your needs? And say, we need a bridge so that we can get to that market faster. And okay, here is the cash, build that bridge, right? So those quick impact projects were extremely, I mean, they were in a sense demand driven, right? They were unstructured. They were based on the needs expressed by communities. I mean, with all the caveats that comes. I mean, one of the key points that I'm trying to suggest here is relates to the identification of needs and who should be in charge of that. I mean, even assuming that relief and development can work unproblematically together, relief and development activities can be unproblematically be joined together. Well, what needs, what priorities? And I discussed different examples or ways in which those models were set up. I mean, by reference to neoliberal agendas, by reference to new approaches to conceiving poverty in a multidimensional way, by practitioners' approaches such as Robert Chambers and his ideas of bottom-up approach, or indeed by, in more grounded ways, by thinking about the needs as defined by host countries, as defined by local communities, as defined in zonal terms, I mean, in zone-specific terms, without a distinction between refugee and local communities. I mean, obviously, each of them has their own, well, positives and their own limitations that remain for us to discuss, and we can do that in the second part of the program. Again, here are some examples of income generating programs. Perhaps the last mention relates to this development assistance to end refugees, as it became quite prominent because it was linked specifically and explicitly to the end of the refugee cycle, if you wish, to the end of refugee caseloads. It was a framework linked to durable solution. And DAR relates to a programming approach which aims to place refugee concerns and those of the host communities in development agendas, mobilize additional development assistance, and improve burden sharing. Right? It seeks to promote a better quality of life and self-reliance for refugees and prepare them for durable solutions, and to contribute to poverty eradication in refugee hosting areas. I mentioned DAR because it's one more example of the ways in which the idea of linking refugee, and indeed specifically refugee assistance, to development aids came to be configured. There is no linear sequence in the examples I provided. In fact, I emphasized how each of them operated in different contexts, primarily as a response to the way in which host communities, local communities, international communities, and development needs interacted. So once again, it was the relief, refugee aid, development continued as a space is very much, as we said 2 sessions ago, a space to be carved out, a space in continuous transformation. And I simply provided a few examples. But to sum up, you can read these slides to identify common threads and common points cutting across these various acronyms and projects and policies, and to identify, to me, the key assumptions that are shared across all of them. Number one, the origins of the conflict can in part be located in processes of underdevelopment. So lack of development becomes in and on itself a cause, or certainly enters into a relation with refugee displacement. Lack of development in host communities enters into a relation with refugees and refugee communities through the notion, for example, of the refugee burden, and lack of development as an impediment to the future prospects of post-conflict or post-civil war countries becomes invested by programs that aim to give refugees kind of agency for the rehabilitation, reconstruction, and improvement of the country's prospects. Second, and that is the crucial assumption, crisis end, right? Crisis end, and after that, we can begin thinking about the prospect and the future of each country. Again, one of the big assumptions. In the following video, I will look at some critiques in relation to these 2 assumptions and more.